I still wake up screaming, even after 30 years. The doctors tell me it's night terrors, that my mind is trying to process trauma. But I know the truth. What I saw in that monastery wasn't trauma. It was something that should have remained buried beneath those ancient stones, something the monks died trying to contain. They say the human mind blocks out memories too terrible to bear, but mine won't let me forget. Every night, I see Brother Malachi's face as the shadow consumed him, hear the wet, tearing sounds that came from the catacombs, smell the incense that couldn't mask the stench of decay, and worst of all, I remember what was written on those walls in blood, the words that explained why the monastery had no mirrors, why the monks never cast shadows in the candlelight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because if you're going to understand what happened at St. Dominic's Monastery in the winter of 1885, you need to know that some doors were never meant to be opened. Before we descend into the darkness together, I need to know you're ready for this journey. If you can hear my voice right now, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, because the story you're about to hear is just the beginning. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to know who else is awake in the darkness, who else understands that the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. Hit that notification bell, because once you hear what I survived, you'll want to know what other secrets I've carried all these years. Now let's go back to Montana territory, to the winter when the snow fell so thick it buried the roads, when I was just 23 years old and foolish enough to think I understood the nature of evil. My name is Thomas Garrett, and in December of 1885, I was a journalist for the Helena Independent. I'd been assigned to write a human interest piece about St. Dominic's Monastery, a Benedictine house that sat in the remote mountains about 40 miles north of Helena. The monastery had been there since 1867, built by monks who'd come from Bavaria seeking isolation and spiritual purity in the American wilderness. My editor thought it would make for good Christmas reading. Peaceful monks, mountain solitude, that sort of thing. I took the assignment because I needed the money and because I was young enough to find the idea of spending a few days in a monastery romantic in a brooding, intellectual sort of way. I'd read too much Poe and not enough scripture. That was my first mistake. The stagecoach dropped me at the base of the mountain on a Tuesday afternoon. The driver, an old German named Klaus, gave me a strange look when I told him where I was headed. He said something in his native tongue, then spat in the snow. "You watch yourself up there," he said in heavily accented English. "That place, it's not right. The monks, they don't come down to town no more. Not for 3 years now." I laughed it off, thinking he was just being superstitious the way old-timers are, trying to spook the city boy. He didn't laugh with me. He just clicked his tongue at his horses and drove away, leaving me standing in the snow with my leather satchel and notepad, watching his wagon disappear into the white curtain of falling snow. The walk up the mountain took 2 hours. The path was narrow and treacherous, winding between towering pines that seemed to lean in toward me like gossips sharing secrets. The snow had that peculiar quality of muffling all sound, creating a silence so complete it felt almost alive, pressing against my eardrums. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how pristine and untouched. I didn't realize then that nothing was watching me from those trees, because nothing lived there anymore. Even the birds had abandoned that mountain. St. Dominic's Monastery appeared suddenly through the snow, a massive structure of gray stone that looked like it had grown out of the mountain itself rather than been built upon it. It was Gothic in style, with high arched windows and a bell tower that stretched up into the white sky like an accusing finger. The architecture was beautiful in a severe, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that makes you feel small and aware of your own insignificance. I stood at the iron gates for a moment, catching my breath, admiring the craftsmanship. The gates themselves were worked into intricate patterns. I noticed later they were all religious symbols, crosses and saints and scenes from Scripture. What I didn't notice then was that every single image was of judgment, punishment, or damnation. There wasn't a single scene of mercy or redemption among them. I pulled the bell rope, and somewhere deep inside the monastery, a bell tolled. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, and in that echo, I could have sworn I heard something else, a kind of whisper or sigh, like the building itself was breathing. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting just on the other side. The monk who greeted me was tall and painfully thin, with sunken eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. He wore the traditional black habit of the Benedictines, but something about it looked wrong. like the fabric absorbed light rather than simply being dark. "Mr. Garrett," he said in a voice that sounded like wind through a crypt, "we've been expecting you." He didn't ask how I'd made it through the snow, or whether I was cold. He simply turned and walked back into the darkness of the monastery, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed. The door swung shut behind me with a sound like a coffin lid closing, and I felt the temperature drop at least 10 degrees. Inside the monastery was somehow colder than outside, a damp, penetrating cold that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "I am Brother Aldrich," the monk said without looking back at me. "I will show you to your cell." Cell, not room. I should have paid attention to the language he used. We walked through corridor after corridor, all of them lit by candles that barely pushed back the darkness. The walls were bare stone, and our footsteps echoed in a way that made it sound like there were more than just two of us walking. I tried to make conversation, asking about the history of the monastery, about the daily life of the monks, but Brother Aldrich answered in monosyllables, or not at all. The silence grew heavier with each unanswered question until I gave up and just followed, watching the way his shadow stretched and moved on the walls ahead of us. That's when I noticed something odd. The candlelight was coming from sconces on the right side of the corridor, which meant Brother Aldrich's shadow should have been cast to the left, but it wasn't. His shadow was walking on the right side, between him and the light source. I blinked and looked again, thinking it must be a trick of the flickering flames. But no, his shadow was definitely on the wrong side. I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it again. What would I even say? "Excuse me, brother, but your shadow seems to be defying the laws of physics." I convinced myself I was tired from the journey, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim light. Brother Aldrich stopped at a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. "Your accommodations," he said, gesturing into the darkness beyond. I peered inside and saw a small stone chamber with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a chair, and a single candle burning on the desk. There was a crucifix on the wall above the bed, but unlike most crucifixes, this one showed Christ with his eyes open, staring straight ahead with an expression that looked less like suffering and more like warning. "Vespers are at 6, Brother Aldrich continued. "You are welcome to attend. Dinner is at 7 in the refectory. Do not leave your cell after Compline, which is at 9. No matter what you hear in the night, do not leave your cell. This is very important, Mr. Garrett. Do you understand?" The intensity in his voice when he said those last words made my skin prickle. Why? What would I hear? He stared at me for a long moment, and in the candlelight, I could see that his eyes weren't just sunken. They were haunted, filled with a fear so deep it had become a permanent part of his expression. "The monastery is old," he said finally. "Old buildings make noise. Pipes settling, wind in the eaves, that sort of thing. It can be disturbing to those unaccustomed to it. For your own peace of mind, please remain in your cell once the evening prayers are complete." Then he turned and walked away, his shadow, still on the wrong side, following him down the corridor. I stepped into the cell and closed the door behind me. The room was barely larger than a prison cell, which I suppose was the point. Monastic cells are meant to be places of contemplation and self-denial, not comfort. I set my satchel on the desk and sat down on the bed, which was about as comfortable as lying on a board. I pulled out my notepad and began to write down my first impressions, but my hand was shaking slightly, and I couldn't quite capture the feeling of the place. How do you describe a cold that isn't just physical? How do you explain the way the silence seemed to have weight? I gave up after a few minutes and decided to explore a bit before Vespers. I had 2 hours, and I wasn't about to spend them sitting in that cell staring at the crucified Christ with his warning eyes. The corridor outside my cell stretched in both directions, lit by the same inadequate candles. I chose left arbitrarily and began walking, my shoes making soft sounds on the stone floor. I passed door after door, all of them closed, all of them identical. I wondered how many monks lived here, why the place felt so empty despite being obviously inhabited. The monastery had been built to house 50 monks, according to my research, but I hadn't seen anyone except Brother Aldrich. Where was everyone? I turned a corner and found myself in what appeared to be the main chapel. It was a vast space with a high vaulted ceiling and rows of wooden pews, facing an altar. The altar itself was elaborate, carved from dark wood and adorned with gold leaf that glinted in the candlelight. Behind it was a massive painting of St. Dominic, but something about the painting bothered me. St. Dominic was looking over his shoulder, his face twisted in an expression of horror, and he was pointing at something behind the viewer. I turned to look at what he was pointing at, but there was nothing there except the empty pews, the door through which I'd entered. I walked up the center aisle toward the altar, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As I got closer, I realized what was bothering me about the painting. St. Dominic wasn't just looking over his shoulder. He was trying to run away from something. The folds of his robe suggested movement, as if he'd been captured mid-flight, and the horror on his face wasn't the horror of witnessing suffering or confronting evil. It was the horror of being pursued. I stood before the painting, craning my neck to take in the full scope of it, and that's when I noticed the shadow at the edge of the canvas, barely visible in the dark paint. It was formless, a darkness darker than the background, and it had what might have been reaching tendrils or hands extending toward the fleeing saint. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from directly behind me, and I jumped, my heart hammering. I spun around to find an elderly monk standing there, so close I could have touched him. I hadn't heard him approach at all, not a single footstep. He was smiling, but it was a strange smile, not reaching his eyes, which were milky with cataracts. "Brother Malachi," he said, extending a withered hand. "I'm the prior here. You must be our guest, the journalist from Helena." I shook his hand, trying to calm my racing pulse. His grip was cold and dry, like shaking hands with a bundle of sticks. "Yes, Thomas Garrett. I'm sorry you startled me. I was just admiring the painting." Brother Malachi nodded slowly, his cloudy eyes never leaving my face. "It's a remarkable work, commissioned when the monastery was built. The artist was a monk himself, Brother Sebastian. He had visions, you see, terrible visions of things that lurk in the shadows, things that most people can't see. He painted what he saw, and then he went mad. They found him in the bell tower 3 days after he finished it, his eyes clawed out by his own hands. He said this as casually as if he were describing the weather, that strange smile never faltering. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That's horrible. Why would you keep such a painting in your chapel?" The prior's smile widened slightly. "Because it's true, Mr. Garrett. Brother Sebastian painted the truth, and truth, no matter how uncomfortable, belongs in the house of God." He turned to look at the painting, his blind eyes somehow seeming to focus on the shadowy figure pursuing St. Dominic. "Do you know why St. Dominic is running in that image?" I shook my head, then realized he probably couldn't see the gesture. "No, I don't. Because he spent his life fighting heresy, casting out demons, confronting the darkness in human souls. And when you spend that long staring into the abyss, Mr. Garrett, eventually the abyss stares back. Eventually, it follows you home." He turned back to me, and in the candlelight, his cataracts seemed to glow faintly. "Brother Aldrich told you not to leave your cell after Compline, yes?" "Yes, but he didn't really explain why." Brother Malachi was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "This monastery is built on a very old place, Mr. Garrett. The Native Americans who lived in these mountains before us called it the Shadow Ground. They said that long ago. A door had been opened here, a door to somewhere else, and that sometimes things came through. They made offerings to keep the door closed, performed rituals to appease whatever was on the other side. When the monks arrived, they thought such beliefs were superstition, primitive paganism. They built their monastery right on top of the sacred site, consecrated it, believing their faith would protect them from any darkness." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. They were wrong. Before I could respond, before I could ask what he meant, a bell began to toll. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating in my chest. "Vespers," Brother Malachi said, his voice returning to a normal volume. "Come, Mr. Garrett. You should witness how we pray. You'll need to write about it for your article, after all." He turned and walked toward a side door, moving with surprising confidence for a blind man. I followed, my mind reeling from what he'd told me a dozen questions forming, but something in his demeanor suggested the time for questions had passed. We entered a smaller chapel where I could see monks filing in, perhaps 20 of them in total. They moved in silence, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods, and took their places in the pews. Brother Malachi gestured for me to sit in the back, and I did, watching as the prior made his way to the front. The service began, and it was unlike any religious service I'd ever attended. The prayers were in Latin, which I expected, but the tone was wrong. Instead of the peaceful, contemplative quality I'd heard in other churches, there was an urgency to these prayers, almost a desperation. The monks chanted their responses in voices that shook with emotion, fear, pleading. I couldn't quite identify it, and the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't praying to ask for blessings or give thanks. They were praying for protection. I found myself scanning the faces of the monks I could see, and what I noticed made my blood run cold. Several of them had dark circles under their eyes, so pronounced they looked like they'd been beaten. Others were shaking slightly, their hands trembling as they held their prayer books. And every single one of them, without exception, kept glancing nervously at the shadows in the corners of the chapel, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. The service lasted about 40 minutes, and when it ended, the monks filed out in the same silence with which they'd entered. Brother Malachi approached me, that unsettling smile back on his face. "Dinner will be served shortly. Brother Aldrich will escort you to the refectory." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Brother Aldrich appeared at my elbow. I hadn't heard him approach either. "Did anyone in this place make noise when they walked?" "Come," he said simply, and once again I followed, leaving Brother Malachi standing alone in the chapel. His blind eyes pointed in my direction even as I walked away. The refectory was a long, narrow room with a single wooden table running down its center. The monks filed in and took their seats in silence, leaving a space near the head of the table for me. The meal was simple: bread, thin soup, and water, and it was eaten in complete silence. This was part of the Benedictine tradition, I knew, but the silence here felt different from the contemplative quiet I had experienced in other religious settings. This silence was tense, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. I tried to eat, but I had no appetite. I found myself watching the monks, really looking at them for the first time, and what I saw troubled me deeply. They were all thin, unhealthily so, their faces gaunt and their eyes sunken. They ate mechanically, bringing spoon to mouth with the regularity of clockwork, but there was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction. They looked like men who ate only because they had to, because their bodies demanded fuel even though their spirits had given up. And the shadows, God help me, I wasn't imagining it. Their shadows were wrong. In the light from the candles lining the walls, every shadow should have been cast in the same direction, but they weren't. Some shadows fell to the left, some to the right. Some seemed to pool beneath their owners like spilled ink, and one monk, sitting about halfway down the table, appeared to cast no shadow at all. The space around him was illuminated, but there was no dark silhouette to mark his presence. I looked down at my own shadow, cast normally on the floor beside my chair, and felt a wave of relief, so intense it was almost dizzying. At least I was still tethered to the natural world. At least the laws of physics still applied to me, even if they seemed to have abandoned this place. After dinner, Brother Aldrich escorted me back to my cell. As we walked through the corridors, I noticed something I had missed before. There were no mirrors anywhere in the monastery. In fact, there were no reflective surfaces at all, no polished silver, no glass windows, nothing that could cast back an image. I asked Brother Aldrich about this, and he stopped walking so abruptly I nearly collided with him. "We have no need for vanity here," he said, his voice tight. "The rule of Saint Benedict teaches us to focus on the spirit, not the flesh." It was a reasonable answer, but the way he said it, the tension in his voice, suggested there was more to it than simple religious devotion. We reached my cell, and Brother Aldrich turned to face me. In the candlelight, his face looked almost skeletal, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. "Remember what I told you, Mr. Garrett. Do not leave your cell after Compline, no matter what you hear, no matter what you think you hear. Stay in your cell with the door closed until morning." His intensity frightened me. What am I going to hear? He opened his mouth as if to answer, then closed it again. "Pray that you hear nothing," he said finally, and then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor with that impossible wrongness of his shadow following him. I entered my cell and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment and trying to steady my breathing. This assignment was supposed to be a simple human interest story, a puff piece about peaceful monks living in mountain isolation. Instead, I'd stumbled into something that felt profoundly wrong, a place where shadows defied physics and blind priors spoke of doors to other places. I should have left then. I should have gathered my things, walked down that mountain in the dark, and never looked back. But I was young and arrogant, convinced that everything had a rational explanation. I told myself the shadows were tricks of the inconsistent candlelight, that the monk's fearful behavior was just the result of isolation and religious fervor taken too far. I told myself a lot of things that night, lies I wanted desperately to believe. I sat at the desk and tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. My mind kept returning to that painting in the chapel, to the shadow pursuing St. Dominic, to Brother Malachi's words about the abyss staring back. I pulled out my pocket watch and saw it was nearly 9 o'clock. Compline would be starting soon. I heard the bell toll somewhere in the monastery's depths, and then, faintly, I heard the voices of the monks raised in prayer. The sound was muffled by the stone walls, but I could make out the rhythmic quality of it, the rise and fall of liturgical chanting. It should have been comforting, the sound of devotion, but instead it made me think of prisoners calling out from their cells, of desperate men begging for mercy from an implacable judge. The prayers went on for about 20 minutes, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat at the desk, my candle burning low, and waited. For what, I wasn't sure. The monastery settled into stillness, and I found myself staring at the door, wondering what Brother Aldrich thought I might hear, what he was so desperate for me to avoid. An hour passed. Nothing happened. I began to relax, to feel foolish for being so affected by the monk's obvious paranoia. I even laughed a little at myself, at how easily I'd been spooked by a bunch of isolated religious fanatics. I should have learned by now that the universe has a dark sense of humor about such things. It started as a whisper. Not words exactly, but something that sounded almost like words, coming from somewhere outside my door. I told myself it was wind, pipes settling, all the things Brother Aldrich had mentioned, but the whisper grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. All around me, the stone walls of my cell seemed to be whispering, a sound like 1,000 voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I stood up from the desk, my heart starting to race again. The whispers grew louder still, and now I could almost make out words. Latin words, I thought, the same prayers I'd heard during Vespers, but twisted somehow, reversed or inverted. And underneath the whispers, I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps in the corridor outside my cell, moving slowly from left to right, passing my door. I stood frozen, staring at the door, watching the gap at the bottom where candlelight from the corridor should have been visible. The gap was dark. Something was blocking the light, something standing just outside my door. The footsteps stopped. The whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid, and the frantic beating of my heart. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. I want to be clear about something. The door was locked from the inside. I had turned the key myself. The handle was turning anyway, moving smoothly despite the locked mechanism, as if locks meant nothing to whatever was on the other side. The handle turned completely, and the door swung open. There was nothing there. The corridor was empty, lit by the same inadequate candles, showing nothing but bare stone walls and closed doors. I should have felt relief, but I didn't, because while I couldn't see anything in the corridor, I could see the candle flames. They were all bending toward my cell, as if blown by a wind that wasn't there, as if something invisible was moving past them toward me. And on the wall of the corridor, directly across from my open door, I saw a shadow. It was the shadow of a man, but no man was casting it. It stood alone, a dark silhouette that seemed somehow more real than the dim corridor around it. And as I watched, frozen in terror, it began to move. It didn't walk. It glided along the wall, defying perspective, maintaining its proportions as it moved when it should have stretched and distorted. And it was coming toward my door. I slammed the door shut with a cry and turned the key, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I backed away until I hit the wall opposite the door, my breath coming in gasps. I heard the footsteps again, right outside my door now, and then I heard something else, a wet, slithering sound, like something soft dragging across stone. The gap at the bottom of the door went dark again, and I knew something was standing there, right on the other side of that thin barrier of wood. Then came the scratching, long, slow scratches, as if something with claws was dragging them down the outside of the door. The sound made my teeth ache, made something primal in my brain scream at me to run. But there was nowhere to run. I was trapped in that cell with nothing between me, whatever was outside except a locked door and the rapidly diminishing hope that locks meant anything here. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away from my door, fading back into the depths of the monastery. The whispers in the walls gradually subsided, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the door, jumping at every small sound. The candle on the desk burned lower and lower, and I found myself praying for it not to go out, terrified of being left in darkness with whatever walked these halls. Morning came eventually, as it always does, even in the darkest of places. I heard a bell toll somewhere in the monastery, calling the monks to lauds, the morning prayers. Only when I saw daylight coming through the crack under my door did I finally stand up, my legs stiff and aching. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find claw marks on the outside, but the wood was unmarked. The corridor was empty and looked almost normal in the gray morning light filtering in from somewhere. I stepped out, and that's when I saw it. On the floor outside my door was a wet stain, dark and viscous, forming a puddle about 3 feet wide. It looked like oil, but thicker, and it gave off a faint smell that reminded me of rot and copper. I knelt down to examine it more closely and saw that it seemed to be slowly sinking into the stone floor, being absorbed by the porous rock. Within minutes of my watching, it had disappeared completely, leaving no trace it had ever been there. I went looking for Brother Aldrich. I needed answers, needed to know what the hell was happening in this place. I found him in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, praying with an intensity that seemed almost violent. His lips moved rapidly, his hands clutched together so tightly his knuckles were white. I approached him, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, but he didn't acknowledge my presence until I spoke. "Brother Aldrich, we need to talk. Something happened last night." He held up one hand, silencing me, and finished his prayer before standing and turning to face me. In the morning light, he looked even worse than he had the day before. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark purple circles beneath them, and his face was pale, almost gray. "You stayed in your cell," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, but something came to my door. Something tried to get in, but it didn't. Again, not a question. No, but what was it? What's happening here? Last night I heard things, saw things. Brother Aldrich grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so thin. "Lower your voice," he hissed, glancing around the empty chapel as if afraid of being overheard. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." He led me out of the chapel and through a series of corridors I hadn't explored yet. We went deeper into the monastery, descending 2 flights of stone stairs, until we reached a heavy iron door. Brother Aldrich produced a large key and unlocked it, the mechanism grinding with disuse. "What we tell you now, you cannot write about," he said, pausing before opening the door. "I know you came here to write a story, but some stories are not meant to be told. Do you understand?" I didn't, but I nodded anyway. He pushed the door open, and we entered what appeared to be the monastery's archives. The room was long and narrow, lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding books, scrolls, and papers. But it was also a gallery of sorts. On every available wall space hung paintings, dozens of them, all clearly done by the same hand. I walked slowly along the shelves, examining the paintings, and felt a cold weight settling in my stomach. They were all variations on the same theme, dark, shapeless forms emerging from shadows, reaching toward terrified figures. Men with no shadows, shadows with no men. And in the corner of each painting, barely visible, was a date. The earliest was from 1867, the year the monastery was founded. The most recent was from 3 weeks ago. "Brother Sebastian," I said, remembering what the prior had told me, "the monk who painted the altarpiece." Brother Aldrich nodded. He was the first to see them clearly. The rest of us, we caught glimpses, felt presences, woke with unexplained bruises and cuts. But Sebastian could see them as clearly as I see you now. He tried to warn us with his paintings, tried to show us what was happening. By the time we believed him, it was too late. Too late for what? Brother Aldrich walked to a desk at the far end of the room and picked up a leather-bound journal. "This is Brother Sebastian's diary. The last entry was written the night before he climbed the bell tower and clawed out his eyes. Would you like me to read it to you?" I nodded, unable to speak. Brother Aldrich opened the journal to the last page and began to read in a flat, emotionless voice. "I understand now why the indigenous people made offerings here, why they performed their rituals. The door was always here, built into the very fabric of this place long before any humans set foot on these mountains. The tribes didn't open it. They found it open and learned to keep it closed. We, in our arrogance, broke their wards, shattered their protections, built our sanctuary over their barrier, and now the things that were kept out are coming through. I've seen them clearly now, in all their terrible glory. They are shadows, but they are also more than shadows. They are the spaces between thoughts, the darkness behind closed eyelids. the absence that defines presence. They feed on our reflections, on the images we cast. That's why they take our shadows first. They're learning to wear us, to become us. Last night, I saw Brother Malachi in the corridor after Compline, but when I looked again, it wasn't Brother Malachi. It was his shadow wearing his shape, and where his eyes should have been, there was only darkness looking out. How many of us are left? How many of my brothers are still themselves? And how many are just shells animated by shadow? I cannot bear to look anymore. I cannot bear to see the truth. Better to be blind than to witness the dissolution of the world I thought I knew. Brother Aldrich closed the journal and looked at me. 3 days after he wrote that, we found him dead in the bell tower. His eye sockets were empty, and on the wall, written in his blood, were 4 words. They're all shadows now. I felt my legs go weak and had to grip the edge of a shelf to steady myself. You're telling me that some of the monks aren't really monks anymore? That they've been replaced by shadows? Not replaced. Possessed, maybe. Worn like garments. We don't fully understand it. What we do know is that the longer we stay here, the stronger their hold becomes. We lose ourselves by degrees. First, the shadows stop falling right. Then you start to feel cold all the time. A cold that comes from inside. Then you begin to forget things. Who you were, where you came from, why you came here. And finally, one night, you wake up and you're not you anymore. You're something that remembers being you. Something that can pretend to be you, but underneath, you're just shadow and hunger. Then why stay? I asked, my voice rising despite his earlier warning. Why don't you all just leave? Brother Aldrich laughed, and it was the saddest sound I've ever heard. We tried. In 1868, after the first monk disappeared, not Brother Sebastian, there was one before him. Half the brotherhood left. We found their bodies 3 miles down the mountain, frozen solid. But the strange thing was, they were all smiling. Happy, peaceful smiles, like they'd finally found what they were looking for, and none of them had shadows. Even the bodies, lying there in the snow with the sun shining down, no shadows. He set the journal down and walked to a painting near the back of the room. This one was different from the others. It showed the monastery from above, a bird's-eye view, and I could see something I hadn't realized before. The structure wasn't random. The halls and rooms formed a pattern. A symbol I didn't recognize, but that made my eyes hurt to look at. The monks who built this place, Brother Aldrich continued, they thought they were following standard architectural plans for a Benedictine monastery. But looking at it now, we can see they were influenced, guided to build in this specific configuration. The whole structure is a key, Mr. Garrett. Every corridor, every room, every wall. It's all designed to open the door a little wider. We don't live in a monastery. We live in a machine, and every day we spend here, every prayer we speak within these walls, we're operating that machine, turning the key a little more. That's insane, I whispered. Is it? Look at this. He led me to a section of wall between 2 bookcases and pointed at what I'd taken to be natural variations in the stone. But looking closer, I could see they were markings, very faint, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. These are older than the monastery, Brother Aldrich said. Much older. We found them under the plaster when we were trying to seal a crack in the wall. They're everywhere, hidden beneath the surface. Brother Malachi believes they're a language, though not one any human ever spoke. Instructions, maybe, or warnings. I reached out to trace one of the marks, and the moment my finger touched the stone, I felt it, a pulse, like a heartbeat, coming from deep within the wall. I jerked my hand back, but I could still feel it, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own pulse, drawing it into alignment. It's alive, I breathed. The building itself is alive. Alive isn't quite the right word. Aware, maybe. Conscious in a way that has nothing to do with life as we understand it. And it's getting stronger. Every year, the incidents become more frequent, more aggressive. 20 years ago, you might go months between events. Now, something happens almost every night. The shadows grow bolder, less concerned with hiding what they are. A terrible thought occurred to me. Brother Aldrich, look at me. Look at my shadow. He did, and I saw relief flood his face. You're still yourself. Your shadow falls true. Whatever protection you have, being an outsider perhaps, it's holding for now. For now. Nothing here is permanent, Mr. Garrett, except the darkness. Even stone wears away eventually. We stood there in silence for a moment, and then I heard it, a sound from somewhere above us, a dragging footstep, followed by a wet slither. Brother Aldrich's face went pale. We need to leave. Now. This is the lowest level of the monastery, and they don't usually come down here during the day. But He didn't finish the sentence. The lights went out. All of them, every candle in the room, snuffed out in an instant as if a giant hand had passed over them. We were plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that seems to have texture, to press against your skin like something physical. I heard Brother Aldrich's breathing, quick and panicked, somewhere to my left. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't make a sound. Maybe it will pass us by." But even as he said it, I heard the door at the top of the stairs creak open. The wet, slithering sound came again, closer now, descending the stairs. I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the shelf behind me, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. In the darkness, my other senses seemed to sharpen. I could smell that rotten copper, scent I'd smelled outside my cell, stronger now. I could feel a coldness moving through the room, not like cold air, but like cold itself was an entity, searching, and I could hear it breathing. If breathing was the right word for the sound, it was like wind through a cavern, or waves pulling back from a shore, rhythmic and wet and utterly wrong. Something brushed against my shoulder. I bit down on my tongue to keep from screaming, tasting blood. Whatever had touched me moved past, and I heard Brother Aldrich gasp. Then came a sound I'll never forget, Brother Aldrich's voice, but wrong, speaking from two places at once. The first voice came from where he'd been standing, to my left. It said, "I'm here, I'm right here, don't move." But the second voice came from directly in front of me, perhaps 3 feet away. It said exactly the same words at exactly the same time. Perfect synchronization, like a recording played on 2 separate machines. "Brother Aldrich?" I whispered. "Which one is you?" Silence. Then both voices laughed, the same laugh from 2 throats, and one of them said, "Does it matter?" The lights came back on all at once, every candle reigniting simultaneously. I blinked against the sudden brightness and looked around the room. It was empty. Brother Aldrich was gone. I was alone in the archives, surrounded by Brother Sebastian's increasingly mad paintings, with no sign that anyone had been there with me at all. I ran. I didn't think about it, didn't plan it. My body simply took over, driven by pure animal panic. I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, burst through the iron door and into the corridor beyond. I ran through the monastery's winding passages, not caring about direction, just needing to move, to put distance between myself and that room. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, and then I collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath. When I finally looked up, I realized I had no idea where I was. The corridor stretched in both directions, identical stone walls lit by identical candles. I couldn't remember which way I'd come. I couldn't remember how many turns I'd taken. The monastery had seemed large when I arrived, but not this large. It felt like I'd been running for hours through miles of passages, but that was impossible, unless the geometry of the place was wrong, just like everything else. I picked a direction at random and started walking, trying doors as I passed them. Most were locked, but one opened into a small chapel I hadn't seen before. I stepped inside, thinking I could rest for a moment, regroup, and figure out how to find my way back to my cell or, better yet, to the main entrance and out of this nightmare entirely. The chapel was bare except for a simple altar and a crucifix on the wall. But as I looked at the crucifix, I felt my skin crawl. It was upside down, not in the inverted cross sense. The whole thing was just hung wrong way up, with Christ's head pointing toward the floor, and his eyes, which in my cell had been open in warning, were closed here, as if in sleep or death. I approached the altar and saw that it was stained with something dark that had soaked into the wood. The stain formed a pattern, and as I looked at it, I realized it was the same symbol I'd seen in Brother Aldrich's architectural drawing of the monastery, the one that made my eyes hurt to look at. There was something on the altar, I realized. A book, bound in leather that looked uncomfortably like human skin, though I told myself that was impossible. I reached for it, then stopped. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to touch it, to leave this chapel, to keep running. But I needed to understand what was happening here. I needed answers. I opened the book. The pages were covered in the same strange markings I'd seen under the plaster, along with drawings that made Brother Sebastian's paintings seem cheerful by comparison. I couldn't read the text, but the drawings told a story. They showed a world of shadows, a place without light or warmth, or anything that could be called life. And they showed things that lived there, if living was the right word, creatures made of absence, of the spaces between things. The drawings showed these shadow creatures reaching toward our world, pressing against a barrier thinner with each image. And in the final drawing, the barrier was gone. The shadows poured through into a world that looked like ours, and where they touched, reality seemed to fray and darken. I turned the page and found something written in English, added later than the rest of the text. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. To whoever finds this, we were wrong. Wrong about everything. This isn't a place of worship. It's a feeding ground. The prayers don't protect us. They call to them. Every word of Latin, every hymn, every invocation, it's all food for them. They grow stronger on our devotion, feed on our faith. We thought we were praising God, but we were singing to them all along. The indigenous people knew. They made offerings not of worship, but of appeasement, of distraction. They gave the shadows small things, so they wouldn't hunger for large things. But we, in our pride, we gave them everything. We gave them ourselves. If you're reading this, it's already too late for us. But maybe you can still escape. Don't pray. Don't speak. Don't even think too loudly. They're drawn to consciousness, to the light of aware minds. Make yourself small. Make yourself shadow. It's the only way. The text stopped abruptly, ending in a long scratch across the page, as if the writer had been pulled away mid-sentence. I closed the book and backed away from the altar, my mind reeling. If this was true, if the monks' prayers were actually making things worse, then Brother Malachi and the others had been feeding their destroyer for 18 years, thinking they were calling for salvation. I had to get out. I had to leave this place and never come back, warn others to stay away, maybe even find a way to burn the whole structure to the ground, though I suspected fire wouldn't be enough to stop what lived here. I turned to leave the chapel and found the door closed. I didn't remember closing it. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it didn't budge. Locked from the outside, which was impossible because there was no lock on the inside of the door. Just a simple latch that I could see was unengaged. I pulled harder, then started pounding on the heavy wood. Help! Is anyone there? I'm locked in. My voice echoed in the small space, seeming too loud, and I remembered what the book had said about being quiet, about not drawing attention. I stopped shouting and tried the door again, more quietly this time, but it remained immovably shut. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, coming from outside the chapel, converging from different directions. They stopped just beyond the door, and I could see shadows moving in the crack of light beneath it. Mr. Garrett. It was Brother Malachi's voice, friendly and warm. Are you in there? It's time for sex prayers. The brothers are gathering in the chapel. Won't you join us? Brother Malachi, the door is stuck. I can't get it open. That's strange. Let me try from this side. I heard him try the handle, and it opened easily, swinging inward. Brother Malachi stood there with his blind eyes and his gentle smile, and behind him was a crowd of monks, perhaps all 20 of them, standing in complete silence. They were all facing me, their hoods thrown back, so I could see their faces. And every single one of them was smiling the exact same smile as Brother Malachi, not quite reaching the eyes, just a slight upturn of the lips that looked more like a skull's grin than an expression of happiness. There, Brother Malachi said, not stuck at all. You must not have turned the handle properly. Please join us for prayers. I think I'd rather just collect my things and leave, actually. I'm not feeling well. Nonsense. You've barely been here a day. Surely you want to see more of our community before you go. Experience the full rhythm of monastic life. The monks behind him began to move, not walking but gliding forward, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. None of them were casting shadows. Not one. The light from the candles in the corridor fell on them, but created no corresponding darkness on the floor or walls. I stumbled backward into the chapel, and the monks followed, filling the small space. They surrounded me, their smiles never wavering, their eyes reflecting no light. Brother Malachi entered last, closing the door behind him. You know what we are, don't you, Mr. Garrett? His voice had changed, become hollow, like wind through empty pipes. You've read Brother Sebastian's diary. You've seen the paintings. You understand. You're not the real monks. You're shadows. You're wearing them like clothes. The thing wearing Brother Malachi's face tilted its head at an angle no human neck should allow. Yes and no. We're not wearing them. We are them now. We've merged, become one. The man Malachi was still here, somewhere in this flesh. His memories, his personality, his fears, all still present, but filtered through us, interpreted through shadow. We are the monks. We're just more. The other monks, the other things, began to chant. It sounded like Latin, but the words were wrong, inverted, a prayer said backward, and as they chanted, The candles in the chapel began to dim, not extinguish, but fade, as if the darkness was seeping into the light itself, contaminating it. "Why?" I asked, pressing back against the wall. "Why are you doing this? Why does water flow downhill? Why does a moth seek flame? We exist in the darkness between worlds, in the spaces where your light cannot reach. But we hunger for the light, for the warmth of consciousness and life. Your kind opened a door here, built a structure that resonates with our realm, and more than that, you filled it with faith, with devotion, with powerful emotions and focused will. Do you have any idea how bright you shine to us? How irresistible." The thing that had been Brother Malachi stepped closer. "We've been here since the beginning, pressing against the barrier between our world and yours. The indigenous peoples knew. They performed rituals not to worship us, but to keep us out, to reinforce the door. But your monks, in their arrogance, broke those protections. They built their monastery in a configuration that weakens the barrier rather than strengthens it. Every stone laid, every prayer spoken, every bell tolled, all of it tuning the structure like an instrument, playing a song that calls to us. Then take the monastery. Take whatever you want. Just let me go." The thing smiled wider, and I saw that its teeth were too white, too perfect. "But Mr. Garrett, you're part of what we want. A fresh light to draw into the darkness. A new voice to add to our chorus." The monks' chanting grew louder, and I felt something strange happening to the air around me. It was growing thick, viscous, like trying to breathe honey. The shadows on the walls began to move independently of their casters, sliding and stretching, reaching toward me. I looked down and saw my own shadow on the floor, and I watched in horror as it slowly began to separate from me, pulling away like a reflection peeling off a mirror's surface. It hurt. God! It hurt in a way I didn't know was possible. Not physical pain, but something deeper, like having part of your soul torn out. I fell to my knees, gasping, trying to hold onto my shadow, to keep it connected to me, but it continued to pull away. I was losing myself. I could feel it happening, feel my memories starting to blur at the edges, my sense of self beginning to fragment. In another moment, I would be like them, a shadow wearing the memory of a man, pretending to be human while serving something vast and hungry. But then I remembered something. The book on the altar had said not to pray, that prayers fed them, but had also said the indigenous people made offerings of distraction. They gave small things to prevent the loss of large things. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pocket watch, a silver timepiece my father had given me when I turned 21. It was precious to me, irreplaceable, and in the candlelight, its polished surface shone like a mirror. "Here!" I shouted and threw the watch at the thing, wearing Brother Malachi's face. It struck him in the chest and fell to the floor, spinning, its reflective surface catching and throwing back the dim light, and the shadows went mad. Every shadow in the room, on the walls, on the floor, the ones that had separated from the monks, and the one tearing itself from me, they all converged on the watch. The monks' chanting stopped abruptly, and they turned as one to look at where the watch lay spinning on the stone floor. The thing that had been Brother Malachi screamed, and it was the sound of wind through a void, of emptiness given voice. "Reflection," it shrieked. True reflection, not filtered through flesh, not distorted by prayer, pure reflection. The shadows swarmed over the watch like ants on honey, fighting each other to reach it, and in that moment of distraction, I felt my own shadow snap back into place, reattaching to me with a sensation like a dislocated joint popping back into socket. The door was unguarded. I ran. I burst through the chapel door and into the corridor, and I ran like I'd never run before in my life. Behind me, I could hear the shadows fighting over the watch, their screeches and wails echoing through the stone passages. I didn't look back. I just ran, following corridors at random, praying to every god I could think of that I'd find the exit. And maybe someone was listening, because I turned a corner and saw daylight, actual daylight, streaming through the main entrance of the monastery. The door stood open, and beyond them, I could see the snow-covered mountain slope and the gray winter sky. I've never seen anything more beautiful in my life. I ran for that light, expecting at any moment to feel cold hands grab me, to have my shadow ripped away again, to be dragged back into the darkness. But nothing stopped me. I burst through the doors and out into the snow, and kept running, half-sliding down the mountain path. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, until my legs gave out, and I collapsed face-first into a snowbank. I lay there gasping for breath, feeling the cold burn of the snow against my face, welcoming the pain because it meant I was alive. I was real. I was still myself. When I finally had the strength to stand, I looked back up the mountain. The monastery was barely visible through the falling snow, a dark shape against the white landscape. As I watched, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, too far away to make out features, but I could see it was wearing monastic robes. It stood there for a long moment, watching me, and then it raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been a gesture of farewell, or maybe a promise. Then it turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the monastery, and the door swung shut with a sound like thunder that rolled across the mountain. I made it back to Helena 3 days later, half frozen, delirious with fever, my feet black with frostbite. I spent 2 months in the hospital recovering. I told the doctors I'd gotten lost in a blizzard, that I'd had to abandon my belongings and barely made it down the mountain alive. They believed me because the alternative, that I'd fled from living shadows in a possessed monastery, was insane. When I recovered enough to think clearly, I tried to tell people what had happened. I went to the bishop, to the territorial governor, to anyone who would listen, but without proof, without my notes or photographs. It was just the ravings of a man who'd suffered exposure and head trauma. The church sent investigators to the monastery the following spring. They found it empty, not abandoned in the sense of monks having left, abandoned in the sense of having never been occupied. No furniture, no supplies, no books or records. The walls were bare stone, and according to their report, had never been plastered or decorated. It was like the monastery had been built and then immediately left to stand empty. The investigators concluded that I had either hallucinated the entire experience or was trying to perpetrate some kind of hoax. But I knew the truth. The shadows hadn't left. They'd just hidden, pulled back into their spaces between things, waiting for the next group of faithful to arrive, to fill those halls with prayer and devotion, to feed them until they were strong enough to emerge again. I never went back to journalism. How could I? How could I write human interest stories and report on local politics when I'd seen what I'd seen, learned what I'd learned? I became something of a hermit, living on the edge of society, and I spent my time researching, trying to understand what I'd encountered. I've traveled across the country, speaking with indigenous elders who still remember the old stories, with priests who specialize in exorcism, with folklorists and occultists, and anyone else who might have answers. And I've learned that St. Dominic's isn't unique. There are places all over the world like it, places where the barrier between our reality and the shadow realm grows thin, places where things that shouldn't exist press against the walls of our world, seeking entry. Most of the time, the barriers hold. Most of the time, we're safe in our lighted rooms, protected by physics and reason and the simple fact that our world and theirs don't overlap. But sometimes, through intention or accident, through ritual or architecture, or just bad luck, a door gets opened, and when that happens, shadows walk in daylight, and the darkness learns to smile. I'm an old man now, writing this account in the hope that someone will believe it, that someone will understand the danger. The monastery still stands on that mountain in Montana. I've seen photographs of it, taken by hikers who've stumbled across it. In the pictures, it looks abandoned, empty, harmless. But I know better. I know what waits inside those walls, in the spaces between the stones, in the corners where candlelight doesn't quite reach. If you ever find yourself on that mountain, if you ever see St. Dominic's Monastery rising from the snow like a gravestone marking the death of reason, I beg you, don't go inside. Don't think you're brave enough or smart enough or faithful enough to resist. Don't think it can't happen to you, because I was all those things, or thought I was, and I barely escaped with my soul intact. The shadows are patient. They've waited for eons in their lightless realm, and they can wait a little longer. But they're hungry, always hungry, and they're very good at being exactly what you're looking for until it's too late to run. I still have nightmares, even after 30 years. I dreamed that I never left the monastery at all, that my escape was just something the shadows let me believe while they slowly consumed me. I dreamed that I'm still there, walking those endless corridors, my shadows slowly separating from me, my memories fragmenting into darkness. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, when I'm standing near a lamp or a candle, I look down at my shadow on the floor. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, it falls in the wrong direction. It only lasts for a moment of flicker before it snaps back to where it should be. But in that moment, I know that I didn't fully escape. I know that something came back with me, a tiny piece of that darkness, a fragment of shadow embedded in my soul. And I know that when I die, whenever that is, that fragment will grow. It will consume what's left of me and return to where it came from, and it will be just a little bit stronger, a little bit closer to breaking through completely. That's what they do, you see. The shadows don't just take you, they use you. Every person they consume becomes a key, tool, a wedge to force the door open just a little wider. Brother Sebastian understood this before he clawed out his eyes. He understood that every monk in that monastery was no longer a guardian of faith, but a beacon for darkness, calling more shadows through, opening the door a little more with every breath. The indigenous people knew this too. That's why they made their offerings, their sacrifices, not because the shadows demanded it, but because giving them something small and willing prevented them from taking something large and unwilling. It was a bargain, a treaty, a way of acknowledging the shadows' existence while keeping them contained. But we, in our modern arrogance, we don't believe in such things. We build our structures without consulting the old knowledge. We disturb ancient sites without understanding what we're disturbing. And we wonder why the darkness feels closer than it used to, why the shadows seem longer, why we wake in the night with the feeling that something is watching us from the corner of the room. I'm telling you this story not to frighten you, though it should frighten you. I'm telling you this as a warning. The world is not what you think it is. There are spaces between the reality you know, gaps in the fabric of existence, and things live in those gaps. They're always there, always waiting, always hungry, and sometimes, through accident or design, we give them a way in. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember this. Pay attention to your shadow. Make sure it falls where it should, moves when you move, stays connected to you. Because the moment it starts to act independently, the moment it hesitates before following or stretches towards something you can't see, that's when you know they found you. And then, my friend, you have a choice. You can run, as I did, and spend the rest of your life wondering if you truly escaped, or if you're just a shadow's memory of running. Or you can stay and let yourself be consumed and become another voice in their chorus, another key turning in the lock, another crack in the wall between their world and ours. I chose to run. I've spent 30 years running, and I'll run until the day I die. But every night, when the sun goes down and the shadows grow long, I wonder if running was really a choice at all. I wonder if maybe I'm still there, still in that chapel, still watching my shadow peel away from me. I wonder if this whole life I've lived since, this lonely, fearful existence on the margins of society, is just something the shadows let me experience while they slowly digest my soul. There's no way to know for sure. That's the real horror of it. Once the shadows touch you, even for a moment, you can never be completely certain what's real and what's just the dream of something that used to be human. I'm old now, as I said. My time is coming to an end, and I find myself thinking more and more about that monastery, about the monks who stayed, about Brother Malachi and Brother Aldrich and all the others. Are they still there? Those shadow things wearing the memories of men? Still praying their inverted prayers? Still performing their corrupted rituals? Still slowly turning the key that opens the door between worlds? Or did they finally complete their transformation, finally cross over completely into shadow, leaving nothing but empty robes and dust? I'll never know. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls down from the mountains, I sometimes imagine I can hear them, faint and far away, carried on the frozen air, the sound of monks chanting, their voices echoing across the years and miles. And if I listen very carefully, if I really strain to hear, the words they're chanting almost sound like prayers. Almost, but not quite. So that's my story. That's what happened to me in the winter of 1885 at St. Dominic's Monastery in the mountains of Montana. You can believe it or not as you choose. You can dismiss it as the ravings of an old man whose mind has been damaged by exposure and trauma. But if you do, I ask you to do one thing. Tonight, before you go to bed, stand in front of a lamp or a candle. Look at your shadow on the wall or floor. Really look at it. Make sure it's exactly where it should be, doing exactly what it should do. And if it isn't, if it's off by even a little bit, if it moves just a fraction of a second after you do, or before you do, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand that I'm telling the truth. The shadows are real. The door is real. And it's opening wider every day. God help us all when it finally swings wide enough for them to pour through. God help us when the shadows outnumber the light.